welcome to Paranormal Pages. Please drop a like or comment if you want to help the channel. Now let's get into the true scary stories. The Weeping Tape. It all began with the move. My wife, Emily, and I had decided it was time to escape the city and settle into a quieter life, somewhere we could breathe. When we found the house, it seemed perfect. Nestled in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods that stretched for miles, it had an unsettling charm. The creaking floorboards, old brick chimney, and chipped white paint gave it character. The realtor had mentioned something about the previous owner's disappearance, but we'd laughed it off as a strange local legend, small-town stories to spice up the mundane. After a week of settling in, I decided to explore the attic. The stairs leading up to it groaned as if they hadn't been touched in years. Dust hung in the air like thick fog, and the faint scent of mildew tickled my nose. I swung open the creaky door and felt a cold draft, as if the attic itself exhaled. Inside, there were the usual forgotten relics, old photo frames, cobwebbed furniture, boxes of decaying books. But one thing caught my eye immediately, a box marked cassettes. The box was weathered, the label barely legible. I hadn't seen a cassette tape in years. Nostalgia gripped me, and I couldn't resist. I reached inside and pulled out a random tape. There was no label, just the word tomorrow scrawled on it in black marker. Curiosity gnawed at me. Why would anyone keep such a cryptic tape up here? I stuffed it into my jacket pocket and forgot about it until that evening. That night, after dinner, I couldn't shake the urge to play the tape. Our ancient cassette player still worked, a relic from Emily's college days. I popped the tape in and pressed play. There was static at first, a crackling sound that seemed to breathe life into the room. I leaned closer, adjusting the volume, and that's when I heard it, a voice. My voice. "Are you okay?" the voice said, distant and strained. The sound was garbled as if recorded from far away, but unmistakably me. I stiffened, my heart skipping a beat. I glanced at Emily, but she hadn't noticed anything strange yet. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. She looked up from her book, eyes narrowing. "Hear what?" she asked. Before I could answer, the tape continued. The same voice, my voice, said something else, this time much clearer. "Emily, why are you crying?" And then, I heard it, sobbing. Heavy, broken sobbing from Emily, like she was in the worst kind of pain. But the Emily sitting beside me wasn't crying. She looked at me, confused, then at the player, her face paling. "Turn it off," she whispered, her voice shaky. I quickly pressed stop, but my mind raced. Why did it sound like me? And why was she crying? I hadn't recorded this, yet every word was exactly how I spoke. I couldn't stop wondering, what did the rest of the tape hold? Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Emily tried to brush off the tape as some old recording we might have forgotten about, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The voice, my voice, sounded too current. Every inflection, every pause, it was how I spoke now, not years ago. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the faint sound of the woods outside doing little to soothe my nerves. The next morning, I woke early, the tape still lodged in the back of my mind. Emily was in the kitchen, quietly sipping coffee. She hadn't said much since last night, but there was an unspoken tension between us, like we both knew something wasn't right but didn't want to acknowledge it. I grabbed the cassette again, determined to figure out what it meant. This time, I played it alone. I sat on the couch and pressed play, my breath shallow, waiting for the voice. At first, it was the same static from before, a low hiss that built into something more coherent. And then it came, the conversation, but it was different now. It wasn't my voice this time. It was Emily's. "I don't understand," her voice said, strained and frantic. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her sobs followed, each one sharper than the last. I could picture her, broken, confused, pleading for something I hadn't even done yet. "Tell you what?" I whispered aloud, staring at the player as if it would answer me. The tape crackled, and then my voice came again. "I didn't know." I swear, I didn't know. Her sobbing intensified. The sound of her crying felt too real, like she was right there in the room with me, even though I could hear her clinking dishes in the kitchen. A chill ran down my spine. What kind of tape was this? Was it predicting a conversation we hadn't had yet? But how could that be possible? I couldn't stand listening anymore. I hit stop, my hands trembling. I turned toward the kitchen, watching Emily's calm figure through the doorway. She wasn't crying, wasn't panicked, and yet, the tape was so clear. So real. It felt like a window into something that hadn't happened yet, but it was coming. I could feel it. That evening, I tried to bury my thoughts in small talk and mundane tasks, but the tape gnawed at me. I couldn't help myself. I had to know more. After Emily went to bed, I sneaked back into the living room, slid the cassette into the player, and fast-forwarded it to the end. I pressed play again, expecting more static or some looped dialogue. Instead, there was silence, an eerie, suffocating silence. Then, my voice cut through the quiet. "Why are you standing there, Emily?" The words were tense, as if I was afraid. And then, more sobbing. Her sobbing. "Please, no. Don't make me do this," Emily's voice wept, shaking with fear. "I'm so sorry." A sharp noise blasted through the tape, something crashing, something violent. My blood ran cold as the sound dissolved into dead air. There was no explanation, no context, just that chilling fragment of something yet to happen. I sat frozen, the silence in the room unbearable. I knew what the tape was showing me now. It wasn't a recording of the past, it was the future. And it was waiting for me. The following days were tense, like I was walking through a thick fog. Emily and I barely spoke. She could sense something was wrong, though she didn't press me. I couldn't bring myself to tell her about the tape's prediction, about the eerie conversation that hadn't happened yet. Every time she smiled, every mundane interaction between us felt heavy, like a ticking clock counting down to some unseen event. I started avoiding her. I stayed up late, claiming I had work to do, but in reality, I was obsessing over that cursed tape. I couldn't stop playing it, fast-forwarding and rewinding, trying to make sense of it. Sometimes, it repeated the same conversation with Emily sobbing. Other times, I would hear new bits, like fragments of the future unraveling just enough for me to catch glimpses of what was coming. One night, after hours of listening, I heard something new. The voice was unmistakably mine, but this time it sounded distant, almost detached. "What are you doing here?" it said, sharp and accusing. Then, after a long pause, a soft weeping, different from Emily's. The crying was deeper, more guttural, like it came from something else. The sobbing grew louder, as if whoever, or whatever, was crying was standing right next to me. I jumped from my chair, my skin prickling with dread. I hit stop and threw the cassette player across the room. It smashed into the wall, the sound echoing through the house. The crying stopped instantly, replaced by the deafening silence of the empty room. I sat on the floor, staring at the broken player. My chest heaved with panic. That voice, those tears, they weren't Emily's. They weren't mine. The thing on the tape wasn't human. The next morning, Emily confronted me. "What's going on?" she demanded, her voice trembling with worry. I couldn't keep it from her any longer. I told her everything, the tape, the future conversations, the sobbing. At first, she thought I was joking, but the look in my eyes must have convinced her otherwise. I played her the tape, showing her the exact moment where her sobbing began. She sat in silence, her face pale as the recording of her future cries played out. "This isn't possible," she whispered. "It can't be." "It's showing us what's coming," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know how, but it's real. And it's not just us on that tape anymore." Emily's face drained of all color. "What do you mean? What else did you hear?" I hesitated, my throat tightening. I didn't want to tell her. I didn't want to share the unnatural, guttural sobbing that haunted the edges of the tape. But I had no choice. "There's something else. I don't know what it is, but it's not human." Her eyes widened, and for the first time since we'd moved here, I saw real fear in her expression. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We need to get out of this house." But it wasn't that simple. The house, the tape, it all felt connected, like a web we were caught in. And even if we left, there was something growing, lurking just beyond the edge of the conversation, waiting for us. That night, the sobbing on the tape grew louder. And it wasn't Emily's anymore. Emily was right. We should have left that night. But something held me back, a twisted curiosity mixed with dread. The house had become suffocating, its walls thick with an unseen presence. Each time I heard the tape, it felt as if the voices were creeping closer to reality, drawing us towards some inevitable fate. I could feel it tightening around us, a trap set long before we ever arrived. The following evening, I couldn't resist anymore. Emily begged me not to touch the tape again, but I needed answers. There had to be some reason this was happening, some explanation buried beneath the layers of static and sorrow. I slipped the tape back into the mangled cassette player, praying it would work despite its damaged state. The moment I hit play, the sobbing started immediately, louder, more forceful than before. But this time, there was no pretense of conversation. Just weeping. Deep, guttural cries that echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls. I gritted my teeth, my fingers gripping the armrest of the couch. Emily watched from the doorway, her eyes wide with terror. Suddenly, a voice broke through the crying. Not mine. Not Emily's. It was raspy, cold, and barely human. "It's too late," it whispered. "You can't stop it now." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt a cold draft sweep through the room, though the windows were tightly shut. "Who are you?" I muttered, half expecting the tape to answer. The voice didn't respond. Instead, the tape cut to another sobbing sound, Emily's. But this time, the crying wasn't distant. It wasn't a prediction of some future argument. The sound of her weeping was coming from right behind me. I froze, my body turning to ice. Slowly, I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see Emily in the doorway. But she was gone. I stood up, heart pounding, and ran to the bedroom where I'd last seen her. The door was ajar, and the room was dark. "Emily?" I called out, but there was no answer. My voice echoed, hollow and frantic. I flicked on the light, but the bed was empty, the sheets still rumpled from earlier. Suddenly, the house shook with a deep, violent rumble. The lights flickered, and the cassette player whirred to life on its own. The tape rewound, the sound screeching through the speakers. The guttural sobbing returned, this time overlapping with the sound of heavy footsteps, footsteps that seemed to come from beneath the floorboards. I stumbled back, terror gripping me. That's when I saw it. The floor in the center of the room began to crack, thin lines spidering out across the wood, spreading toward me like veins. From the crack, a black, oily substance seeped out, slow at first, then faster, as if the house itself was bleeding. A voice, the same cold, raspy voice from the tape, spoke again, only this time, it wasn't coming from the cassette player. It was coming from beneath the floor. "You found us," it whispered, barely audible but filled with malice. "And now, you'll never leave." The cracks split wider, and before I could react, something began to emerge from the darkness below, something pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes and skin that seemed stretched too tight over its bones. Its body shuddered as it crawled upward, each movement jerky and unnatural. The sobbing continued, now louder than ever, filling the air as the creature's face twisted into a grotesque smile. I turned to run, but the doorway slammed shut, trapping me inside. My breath caught in my throat as the creature's long, skeletal fingers reached toward me, its black, soulless eyes locking onto mine. And then, from the cassette player, Emily's voice broke through one last time, "I'm so sorry." The lights flickered out, leaving me alone with the weeping thing that had crawled from beneath the house. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2. The First Call. It was a quiet Friday night, the kind of night where the stillness weighs heavily on the air. I was sitting alone in my apartment, scrolling mindlessly through social media, when my phone rang. It was late, too late for anyone to be calling, really. The screen blinked with a number I didn't recognize. My finger hovered over the decline button for a second before I, for some reason, decided to answer. "Hello?" My voice echoed back at me from the other end of the line, too perfectly. I paused, unsure if I had misheard. Then it came again, clearer this time. "Please, don't hang up," the voice said. It was mine, an exact replica, down to the slight tremble I hadn't realized I had in my voice. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. A deep unease settled into my bones as the voice continued. "I'm you," it whispered. "And I need your help." At first, I thought it was a prank, some kind of twisted joke. My friends were known for pulling stunts, but this was different. The voice wasn't just mimicking me, it was pleading, desperate. My breath hitched as I glanced around my dimly lit apartment, the shadows seeming to stretch and creep. I could feel my pulse in my throat, every hair on my body standing on end. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. The silence that followed was unbearable. Then, softly, almost as if ashamed, the voice responded. "Don't trust the people around you. They're not what they seem. I know because I'm trapped here, where you could be. And if you don't listen to me, you will be too." The line crackled. I wanted to hang up, to throw the phone across the room and pretend none of this was happening. But some unseen force, kept me from ending the call. Instead, I stayed there, gripping the phone as though it were my only lifeline, my heart racing in my chest. "Where are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The voice hesitated, as if weighing whether to tell me. "I'm close. Closer than you think. But I can't explain everything right now. Just don't let them know you've spoken to me." Before I could ask who they were, the line went dead, leaving me staring at my reflection in the dark screen of the phone, my own wide eyes gazing back at me. Something was very, very wrong, but I couldn't quite figure out what. The silence in my apartment suddenly felt oppressive, thick with tension. I stood up, heart still hammering, and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The street below was empty, nothing but the usual flickering of the streetlights and the hum of distant traffic. Everything seemed normal, but that voice, my voice, kept echoing in my head. I should have been scared, maybe even panicking, but all I felt was a cold, creeping dread. Somewhere, deep down, I knew that this call wasn't random. It was the beginning of something. Something terrible. The following day, I tried to push the strange phone call to the back of my mind, convincing myself it was just a prank, or maybe even a dream. But as much as I tried, the unease lingered, festering just beneath the surface. Every time I looked at my phone, I half expected it to ring again, that voice, my voice, to come through, begging me for help. By late afternoon, the tension became unbearable. I decided to tell Sarah, my girlfriend, about the call. We had been dating for over a year, and she was always the level-headed one, the person who would tell me I was overreacting or that it was just a coincidence. But when I brought it up, she reacted in a way I didn't expect. "That's really strange," she said, her face pale. She looked away for a moment, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a distance between us, something unsettled. "Maybe you should just ignore it. Sometimes it's best not to dig too deep." There was something off in her tone, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't telling me everything she knew. The way she avoided eye contact, the way her hand tightened slightly on her coffee mug, it was as if she was hiding something. "You don't think it's serious?" I pressed, watching her closely. Sarah had always been someone I trusted implicitly, but now, with the warning from that voice in my head, I began to second-guess even the smallest things. She took a long sip from her mug, her eyes scanning the room before settling back on me. "No," she said finally, a little too quickly. "I wouldn't worry about it." But I could see it in her face, she was worried. And that unsettled me more than anything. I spent the rest of the evening on edge, trying to act normal, but my mind kept circling back to that voice on the phone. Who were they? What was I supposed to be careful about? Later that night, long after Sarah had gone home, I sat alone on my couch, unable to sleep. The apartment was too quiet, the shadows too deep. The street outside, normally comforting in its familiarity, now seemed alien, hostile. And then, the phone rang again. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. The same number. My thumb hovered over the answer button, my heart racing. This time, I didn't hesitate. Who are you? I demanded, my voice shaking. You have to be careful, the voice said immediately, no pretense of introduction. It was my voice again, but this time it sounded weaker, more strained. They know that you've heard from me. You don't have much time. What are you talking about? Who are they? My voice cracked as the fear I had been pushing down all day bubbled to the surface. They're watching you. Watching everything, it whispered, the urgency in its tone making my skin crawl. Look for the signs. They'll show themselves soon, but by then, it might be too late. You have to listen to me. Before I could ask more, the call abruptly ended, leaving me in the silence of my darkened apartment. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat there, staring at the phone, feeling like a caged animal. I felt something watching me, the oppressive weight of invisible eyes following my every movement. The voice had told me not to trust anyone, not even those closest to me. But how was I supposed to live like this? As I sat there, contemplating what to do next, a soft creaking noise broke the silence. I turned toward the door, and for a split second, I saw something, a figure, a shadow, just beyond the crack in the hallway. I blinked, and it was gone. The next few days passed in a blur, each moment steeped in paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was constantly being watched. Every time I glanced out my window or down the hallway, I swore I caught glimpses of movement, just out of the corner of my eye, disappearing the moment I focused on it. I didn't know who to trust. Sarah had called a few times, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. Her earlier reaction still haunted me. What was she hiding? And why had the voice, my voice, warned me about those around me? I couldn't tell if I was losing my mind or if something far worse was unfolding, just beneath the surface of my reality. The third call came at 3 a.m. I had barely slept, tossing and turning in my bed, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. The sharp ring of my phone jolted me upright, my hand instinctively reaching for it before I realized what I was doing. This time, though, the voice on the other end wasn't mine. We need to talk, a cold, unfamiliar voice said, its tone dripping with malice. I froze, gripping the phone so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Who are you? I whispered, my voice trembling. That's not important, the voice replied, slow and deliberate. What matters is that you've been chosen. You've heard the warning. But it's already too late for you. A wave of icy dread washed over me. I tried to respond, but the words died in my throat. The voice chuckled softly, a sickening sound that made my skin crawl. They're already in, it said, almost teasingly. They've been watching you for a long time now. It was only a matter of time before you slipped. Before you noticed. I felt a sudden surge of adrenaline, as if something was shifting in the air around me. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse, growing deeper, darker. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding, glancing wildly around the apartment. It felt like the walls were closing in, like the very fabric of my world was unraveling before my eyes. What do you want? I managed to choke out, my voice hoarse with fear. The line crackled, and for a moment, I thought I heard laughter. Not just one voice, but many. A chorus of low, sinister chuckles that sent shivers down my spine. You'll find out soon enough, the voice rasped, its tone dripping with amusement. Don't bother running. There's nowhere you can hide. You've been marked. The phone went dead. I stood there, shaking, unable to process what I had just heard. Marked? What did that even mean? I rushed to the mirror in the hallway, pulling out my shirt, my hands trembling as I scanned my body for any sign, any symbol, that might explain the voice's cryptic words. There was nothing. But then I noticed something else, something that made my blood turn to ice. There, in the reflection, behind me in the dim hallway, stood a figure. It was tall, hunched over, its body cloaked in shadow. Its face was indistinct, but its eyes, those eyes glowed with an unnatural light, piercing through the darkness, staring directly at me. I spun around, gasping, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, the sensation of being watched now unbearable. This wasn't my mind playing tricks on me, this was real. And whatever it was getting closer. In a panic, I grabbed my phone and dialed Sarah's number. She answered on the first ring, her voice groggy with sleep. "Hello," she mumbled. "It's late, are you okay?" "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Something's happening. Something's in the apartment. It's watching me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when she finally spoke again, her voice was flat, almost mechanical. "I told you not to dig too deep." And then the line went dead. I stood frozen in my apartment, the phone slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. Sarah's voice, cold, lifeless, so unlike her, kept echoing in my head. "I told you not to dig too deep." What did she mean? What was she hiding? Panic gripped me, and I backed into the corner of the room, my eyes darting between the windows and the shadows creeping along the walls. The silence felt suffocating, like the entire world had drawn its breath and was waiting for something terrible. A knock sounded at the door. A slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap. I could feel the blood drain from my face. My apartment was on the 5th floor. No one came here without calling first, especially not in the dead of night. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't happening, but the knock came again, harder this time, more insistent. I moved toward the door, my legs shaking, every instinct screaming at me to run. But there was nowhere to go. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling violently. I didn't want to open it, but something deep inside, some compulsion I couldn't understand, forced me to turn the knob. The door swung open to reveal nothing. The hallway beyond was empty, shrouded in an unnatural darkness that seemed to swallow the light. I stepped back, my heart pounding against my ribs. My breathing grew ragged as I stared into the abyss. And then I heard it again, the voice, my voice, echoing from somewhere deep in the shadows. "Please, don't close the door. I need your help." It was me, pleading, just like before. But this time, there was something else in the voice, something broken, hollow. I took another step back, shaking my head, my mind whirling. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. Then the figure emerged. Slowly, almost casually, it stepped into the dim light of my apartment. It wasn't a shadow this time. It was a shape, a reflection of me, but twisted and wrong. Its face was a grotesque mimicry of mine, skin pulled too tight over its skull, eyes sunken and glowing with a sickly yellow light. It smiled, a cruel, mocking version of my own smile. "I told you," it whispered, lips barely moving, "you've been marked." I stumbled back, my legs giving out beneath me as I fell to the floor. The thing moved toward me, each step slow, deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. My skin prickled as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me, as if the very air around me had grown heavier, darker. "Why?" I screamed, crawling backward, trying to put distance between myself and this nightmare. "What do you want from me?" It crouched down, its face inches from mine, its eyes boring into me with a horrifying intensity. Its breath was cold, colder than anything I'd ever felt. "You've already given me everything," it hissed. "You just didn't know it. Every time you answered the call, every time you listened, you let me in. You opened the door." I could feel the truth of its words sinking in, like ice in my veins. I had let this happen. I had let it in. All the warnings, all the whispers, they hadn't been to protect me, they had been leading me to this moment, this inevitable end. Desperation clawed at me, and I tried to push the thing away, but my hands passed right through it, as though it wasn't truly there. And yet, I could feel it, its presence, its cold, creeping darkness wrapping around me, tightening like a vice. "Why me?" I gasped, barely able to speak. "Why did you choose me?" It smiled again, that same twisted version of my own expression, and leaned in closer, its voice a rasping whisper in my ear. "Because you were listening," it said. "And now, you're mine." The lights flickered, and the shadows closed in around me, swallowing the apartment, the world. My vision blurred, and I could feel myself slipping, falling into the darkness. The last thing I heard before everything went black was its laughter, cold, mocking, endless. The next morning, the apartment was quiet. The police arrived after Sarah reported that I hadn't answered her calls. They found my phone lying in the middle of the floor, the screen cracked, but there was no sign of me. The door was locked from the inside, no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle. All that was left behind was my reflection, a faint silhouette in the glass of the hallway mirror, watching, waiting. The end. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Thanks for watching.